Bé, benvinguts i benvingudes a aquesta trobada amb la Rachel Cusk amb motiu de la publicació de Segunda, casa, Asteroide, l'altra casa, les Hores, també gràcies a les editorials per organitzar aquest acte. Bé, no m'acostuma a passar a mi que quan presento autors o autores a rebre molts comentaris de ai, ostres, quina gràcia, quina il·lusió, que fort i tal. M'ha passat només quan hi ha hagut grans estrelles, diguem-ne, el Paul Auster, el Haruki Murakami, Kalo Ben Ausgard, no? I aquest cop també m'ha passat amb el Rachel Cusk. La presència multitudinària aquí també és prova d'això. Això demostra les ganes que tenim tots d'escoltar-nos. Estic molt agraït a biblioteques i a les editorials per aquest privilegi de poder parlar amb la Rachel, una autora que admiro moltíssim, que he estat llegint molt aquests anys, que he recomanat a clubs de lectura, que he recomanat a tallers. Crec que aquí hi ha presència dels clubs de lectura que jo dirigeixo una mica. I sé, ja dic, que hi havia moltíssima expectació, fins i tot tinc una amiga entre el públic que s'ha jugat a pedra, paper, tisora, si venia ella o la seva parella, havia qui es quedava amb els nens, fins aquí arriba l'expectació. Això és una true story, total. I bé, la meva admiració per la literatura Rachel Cusk és que jo crec que trobem poques autores o autors ara amb la llau d'estímuls que suposa les seves obres. No? Hi ha una circulació contínua d'idees, de reflexions, de preguntes, una capacitat d'aprofundir, de qüestionar, d'anar contracorrent, de lluitar contra el clitxé, de treure a la superfície veritats incòmodes, punyents. No? Tot això fan d'ella una autora, jo crec, amb una personalitat única. Ja només que el risc que plantegen els seus llibres, risc tant el tema per la part temàtica, temes, diguem-ne així, incòmodes, punyents, difícil, com també per la part de l'exploració formal. Jo crec que hi ha poquíssimes autores o autors que vagin tan lluny en lo formal i en lo temàtic, i és molt d'agrair. I bé, arribem a això, a Segunda, casa, l'altra casa, que m'ha semblat molt brillant, on trobem aquest personatge, 5 cèntims, la Emma, aquesta dona, que busca d'alguna manera, jo crec, és la meva interpretació, alliberar-se, accedir a un coneixement, diguem-ne, més profund de si mateixa, de reconfigurar una mica aspectes del seu caràcter que no l'acaben de convèncer, d'abraçar veritats incòmodes, i per això convida aquest pintor, un pintor atormentat, que la té una mica fascinada, i la visita d'aquest pintor suposa un trasbals emocional, sobretot, i que trenca, diguem-ne, amb la pau, pau mental no, però sí que ella viu una mena d'aïllament tan geogràfic, aquí envoltada de marismes, com un aïllament també mental, té una mena de paràlisis, una mena d'obsessions, i aquesta visita ho trasbalsa tot d'una manera i serveix de catarsis, i em sembla una obra esplèndida. I bé, sense més preàmbuls, comencem ja amb la trobada. Thank you, Rachel, again for being here. So let's start. You have been moving around a lot during your life, living in different places like Canada, Los Angeles, several parts of England, Italy, I think for a short period of time, also now Paris. Would you say this is partially explained by a sort of restlessness that defines your character and that inevitably had a lot to do with you becoming a writer and also with the sort of writing you do?
Well, the moving in the beginning was involuntary. It was an uprooting. The restlessness pre-existed me. My parents were restless, and I think the experience of moving really quite dramatically in childhood from one continent to another is, yes, definitely an experience of awakening or being awoken, whether or not you want to be woken up, you are. And I think that is a common story in the development of an artist, that as I say, whether they want to or not, they're made aware. So awareness is sort of forced on you, and maybe the conditions in which it's forced on you. The things that you are made aware of, whether those are frightening things or rich, amazing things, probably does actually determine the use you make of your gift, your awareness later on. So I think that my awareness was of difficulty, the difficulty of transition, and the difficulty of remaining yourself when you're put in new environments. So I think that those were things that I began to analyze very early on.
And while I was preparing this interview, I came across a piece by Joan Didion called Why I Write that made me, I saw some connections with your work. Let me read this passage. Okay, it's a bit long. My apologies in advance. But she writes, Joan Didion, in many ways, writing is the act of saying I, of imposing yourself to other people, to say, listen to me, see the things the way I do, change your mind. It is an aggressive act, even hostile. You can try to disguise this aggressiveness as much as you want, but you cannot hide the fact that putting words on paper is an invasion, an imposition of the writer's sensitivity on the more private space of the reader. Given how honest, how determined, how against the tide your books are, can we see this somehow the influence of these words on how these words of Joan Didion infuses your work? Do you see? Am I rambling, or there's something there?
So I think that for me, it was more at the beginning about whose version was true, and seeing some gap between how the world and its events was represented in social interactions among adults, and what I, with my own 2 eyes and ears, observed. So I think that the difference between those two things, between the social fabric and the individual perception, was very, very early on for me. And yeah, that's an argument. That's certainly saying no, that's not right. It's this is what's true. That didn't happen in that way. It happened like this. So it's that. I suppose I see writing and all art to a degree as a correction of human subjectivity, human willingness to lie to oneself, to believe, to make life easier by believing things rather than verifying them. So that bringing of a set of events or a part of the world back to its own truth is what I see my job as, I guess.
And on this essay, Joan Didion also says, if I had been blessed with straight access to my own mind, I would not have had any reason to write. Okay? I strictly write in order to find out what I'm thinking, what I'm looking at, what do I see, and what am I scared of. Yeah? Do you see your own impulses and needs as a writer reflected in these words in a way?
Well, in fact, I'm writing an essay at the moment along these lines of trying to, in a very sort of quiet and marginal way, explore particularly why women write, what women's writing is, but some of the things I'm thinking about are about the writing impulse generally itself, and I think that, one of the things I thought was how writing is so close to just telling. And, one of the things in my trilogy that those books absolutely relied on sort of telling as a gift, as a human, a gift that every human has of self-utterance, of bringing themselves, dramatizing themselves, I guess, by telling about themselves. But there's something more sort of basic than that, which is how a child has to, if they've seen something, they have to tell it. They don't want the information to stay inside them. They don't want the knowledge to stay inside them because I guess they know it might hurt them in some way. So they have to tell it. And I think that actually makes writing seem more stupid than than maybe people would like to believe it is. But I think that's very much the at the root of it somewhere. This need to get out what you know, what is inside you.
Good. And reading your work, it becomes obvious how domesticated and conservative many of the literary efforts are. You have pointed out that the novel will be a very poor form of expression if it could not be dismantled, reconstructed from time to time. Playing with the genre, questioning its limits, is one of the major joys for you.
Oh yeah, it's. I don't think I could. I wouldn't write if I had just found my little paddock, my field, and I was just going to do the same thing over and over again. No, to me, the breaking new ground, trying to which is keeping something alive. Really, it's keeping a form alive, and the novel is. It's a very regressive form. No matter how, it's not like art where. Once Picasso turns up, people don't go back to painting like Titian. It's very, very progressive. Whereas in language, James Joyce can write Finnegan's Wake, and that doesn't stop writers 100 years later still writing the kinds of novels that the Victorians wrote. So it's very, very hard to make the novel go forward. It's a very bourgeois form, and it's very bound to I guess, stable life, and it has a sort of material value to it as well, that makes it very resistant to change. And the language economy, is the same, and you can't separate those two things. So I guess the places where I've tried to. It's been said that I dismantle things. I don't think it's that. I think it's modernizing certain things. And those things have largely to do with the difficulty of representing female experience in the novel as it stands. And that, I guess, was sort of what I was trying to do, what I still try to do.
So in a way, you see your literature along the lines of the modernist? The modernist,
yeah, I think
Bloomsbury group and all that.
Yeah, I was talking about my work at another event last night, and somebody mentioned that I was modernist rather than postmodernist because I have no concept of play in in my work, and that it has to be serious. It can't be playful or absurd or abstract, and that is absolutely true. What I do, no matter how, even if it looks innovative, it's innovating from within a very classical tradition, I think, and I mean there are reasons for that. I don't think postmodernism can serve the themes that I think are important and want to talk about, because they are in fact serious and that they are about reality, and so they have to be dealt with in that way.
And following this thread, I read you saying in an interview that when it comes to writing, finding form is the most important thing. And you also say that style is something else, that's more linked to the self. Can you explain a bit the distinction?
Well, I think that the whole, for me, the drifting away of the contemporary novel from its sort of proper aesthetic and moral place is all to do with this idea of narrative storytelling, imagination, fantasy, and that really kind of taking over any kind of obligation to the truth or to reality. That doesn't mean there aren't stories. That doesn't mean life has these shapes in it that are developmental, that do begin and have and live with great intensity and then come to an end. And I mean, everybody knows that from their own experience of living. And so trying to find those forms in life is what I do, and try to use them as a structure, I guess, rather than think, okay, here's a really good plot. You know, that I'm very anti-suspense and anti kind of using, I suppose, people's. You know, it's very easy to make a reader just want to turn pages and get to the end to find out what happens. But if you apply that logic to life, then you're dead. You're hurrying through and getting to the end without having sort of learned that much. So yeah, finding forms that are closer to life is what I'm interested in.
And when you link this style to self, can you explain a bit what do you understand by style and why it's so linked to self?
Well, I think style is the same as personality, and it's something that I think a lot of writers, when they're trying to find themselves and find their voice at the beginning, don't realise that actually writing is exactly the same as living, and that your personality is what goes before you. It's what. And that's why shyness, for instance, is a terrible affliction, that you can't show who you are. So I think, I think the literature of the past was probably richer in style, in writerly personality than now. I don't quite know why that is, but it's something that I rely on. I know that if I'm using that part of myself, that would be exactly the same part that would try to be interesting in having a conversation with somebody, or that part of writing just sort of takes care of itself if you let it.
Mm-hmm. And getting into your characters' minds, following their thoughts is one of the distinguishing marks of your work. What are the main technical challenges for you behind this? Like finding a solid structure for the ideas, getting the right flow, avoid getting carried away or forget about the plot. I don't know. What are the main challenges of getting inside your characters' minds and making it work, do it solid?
Well, I think at this point, I mean, I've written a lot of books and I know a lot about, probably too much for my own good, about what's involved. And I think what I really know now is what you need to before you set off, before you start, what you need. And what you need is to know where you're going. You need to know what is happening on the last page of your book, and if need be, to be able to write your book from the last page all the way back to the first page. And it's extraordinary the ways in which, I mean, like building anything, you can build a novel 2/3 of the way up and suddenly find it can't be built anymore. You've done it wrong. And so I guess having that information before you start, that's the thing that I'm most aware of, and that can be quite inhibiting, because it doesn't quite allow you just to think, I'll just start and see how it goes, and that might be more fun, but I know that it's a
So your books are very outlined before you actually sit down to.
Well, yeah, because also, books take up space, and it is, the Joan Didion's comments about an act of aggression. I'm not so sure about that, but it's certainly you are putting something into space. You are making something exist that didn't exist before, and I think that there is a responsibility to that, for it to justify itself, and I guess it's that. How is this justifying itself? That's what I think about a lot.
Okay. And you had a self-confessed crisis with fiction at the point of your career. Does second place mean that that distrust, to call it somehow, is over, or that you have found a way to make it meaningful again? Maybe using narrative as a more useful mask, to hide yourself behind.
Well, I think I enjoyed putting on a mask again in second place. That felt like a sort of logical movement because the trilogy was so it really seemed to end in silence in some way, in some definitive silence that possibly suggested that there might not be anything else for me to write, and I didn't know whether there would be or not. And I guess the themes that started to amass around me after writing the trilogy were some very kind of difficult to work out things about middle age, about being a woman after womanhood, being a sort of post-feminine, being in that phase of life where your femininity feels pointless, feels that it's obsolete, and that your object value as a woman, as a sexual being, as a familial being even, has sort of fallen away, and that your purpose, your survival of all of those things, and yet your loss of all of those things is very frightening. And I think the question of sort of what your female purpose is in that phase of life is quite a frightening question, and there are no answers. You're in it's women wandering around on their own. It isn't. There's no organised features of this landscape. No one says what it is, or you sort of decide yourself what it is. And so I think what I wanted to do in the second place was take that perspective and to not compare it exactly, but to put it next to a kind of male contrast, which is masculinity in that same phase of life. For an artist who only feels his power rather than his obsoleteness. So that's sort of what second place is a conversation between those two points of view.
So I guess my next question was, what was the spark of the novel? And maybe it was that. No, I was going to ask if it was a character, a place, the Saltmarsh, or a question, or an image. But maybe you've already answered. It was this quest. No, this.
What
that the spark of the novel? What triggered it in the first place?
Well, I mean, the things that I wanted to write about are, because as I said, they're quite featureless, and it's quite hard to see how they could be represented. It's hard to see any universality in them other than in sort of negatives, and so I was sort of struggling a bit to see how you could construct something positive out of that, and then I came across a book that was an out of print book written by an American sort of philanthropist person called Mabel Dodge Luhan, who sort of started a writers and artists colony in Taos in New Mexico, and invited D.H. Lawrence there, and then wrote a book about having D.H. Lawrence to stay. And so that's sort of where I thought, okay, so here's this woman in midlife, feeling essentially that she has had no voice, that she has some power, and that she has the money to, create this nice place for artists to come and express themselves, but she has not expressed herself. And here is D.H. Lawrence, who has expressed himself to death, and that the sort of combat between these two people was a very, very interesting thing for me to read. And so I thought, okay, that's the mask I'm going to put on. I'm going to go and live in this book and fill it with my own content, but use this idea and this structure, and to an extent the voice of it as well. And
all writing is obviously personal, but the reader may think that when you write a more autobiographical book, that the emotional investment is bigger than when you write fiction. But I guess if that mask, the person behind that mask is obviously the writer. Maybe the emotional investment, the challenge is the same, no? in a way? Or,
Yeah, I mean,
or
I
there's
think
a distance that makes it easier?
Yeah.
I don't know.
And one of the things that has really, really changed in literary culture is a sort of contempt for or suspicion of the idea of there being any personal link between a writer and their book, their text. And, that is a very, very big betrayal of the basis of literature. That is a great misunderstanding that I think is, if you wanted a sort of big explanation for it, it might have something to do with what film became in the 20th century, a pure vehicle of storytelling, in a sense, or at least a medium that couldn't be traced back quite so easily to one person, because I suppose it's a collaboration. So, that idea that you almost have to prove or disown your text by making every single thing in it alien to the circumstances of your own life is, well, I think there's been a sort of big reaction to it in that, a generation of writers has, and that's called autofiction, whether that's the right name and whether you can group these people under that. But they've said, they've gone back to the self as a tool of verification. If you say I, and whether the things that happen in your book happen to you, the fact is you're creating a location, I, where you are saying, I verify every single thing that I'm telling you. I own it. I know it because it happened to me. And so that's in a sense a big sort of counter response to the whole idea of imagination. And I'd put myself somewhere in the middle. I think my use of I is probably has more to do with femininity and the fragility of sort of female literary history, I suppose, and of female representations of being. It has never felt like something that it would be very good to sort of make up things about or distance myself from.
Do you think that we are, in general, readers, we are a bit simple, or I don't know how to call it, simple or naive or single-minded, because we see the label novel and we tend to believe it's fiction. There's no emotional investment there. And when we read that that's an autobiography, we tend to think everything's true. No? We move in very...
I don't think that has to do with the simplicity of readers. I think it has to do with labels being put on things that for reasons that escape me. And this is particularly true in England, that these distinctions are made, between one type of thing and another. So, no, I think a reader tends to know what they're looking for, and if they don't find it in your book, it's because it's the wrong book for them, I guess.
And going back to second place, the narrator, as you say, she's seeking for her voice, no? Maybe my interpretation, a new or extended understanding of herself, to shake things up a bit, no? To expand her existence in a way. She aspires to a sort of like greater truth, one that she hopes that art may have the key to it, no? But sees that this truth is painful, it's confusing, and that people, starting with her loved ones, prefer self-deceiving, no? Themselves, the silence, quietness. Can we say that second place is ultimately talking about maybe creative people versus non-creative people in a very wide sense, courage versus adaptation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the two sort of versions of creativity that the book really interrogates, because the moral status of the artist in life is pretty shaky, and I think one one of the things that the narrator sort of goes round and round and tries to understand is how a person can know things in their art that they don't know as a human. And that is a very strange idea, and it's one that I'm completely familiar with. So therefore, what expectations can you have of this artist person who essentially is virtuous and sane and right in the art that they create, and isn't any of those things in their life. And for everybody else, their creations, what they do in the world, I guess has to work in reality, and it's perishable, like reality is perishable. The artist's creation is not perishable, or not if he's good. So, and I think these are things that are questions that everybody has at the moment about identity and how we look at things. Should we look at and appreciate the work of men, for instance, who abused their whatever status and power they had? Can we look at their art without judging, bringing those judgments about conduct into it? They're pretty difficult questions, and I don't know the answer to them.
Yeah, but let me continue more on this matter about art. Second place depicts an artist who is like a monster of ego, in a way. Is this drawn from your personal experience around artists? And I'm not talking about your husband. I know he's an artist. Okay? And is there a perfect explanation why they must be like this, maybe? Or not?
It was something that I got kind of interested in, the bad behavior of, which is that is a well documented, especially in visual artists, the complete neglect of wives and children, the promiscuity, drunkenness, and I suppose I sort of thought, why do artists get away with behaving like that? And and the story of I suppose the women who have sort of lived around those men, many of whom were or could have been or wanted to be artists themselves. And I mean, there's enough stories of slightly contested. The muse, in fact, was responsible for a bit more than she's given credit for. So that whole idea has just interested me, partly because I guess of a sense of injustice in the kind of terms of female creativity and a sort of wondering whether the work of these men would suffer at all, or be judged in a different way as the political climate changes, and whether it should be or not, or So I think it's I don't have an opinion that says yes or no. I'm just interested to see what these changes in society will do to the ways that we look at art. And so that was something I wanted to write about and wanted to have in this book.
And once again, in your work, you ask yourself delicate, very even uncomfortable questions about womanhood, about motherhood. The narrator says at one point, I don't know, that's my translation, it's not. It's free translation, okay? I don't know how to be a woman. I think no one has taught me, something along these lines. And she questions the nature of the love she feels for her daughter, Justine. So battling conventions and cliches surrounding what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a mother, is particularly challenging and, exhausting. This has certainly brought you some problems. So,
yeah. Sometimes I think, why do I have to do this? For whatever reason, I think that there's a decision you can make as a woman writer, which is to set aside the story of womanhood. You can set aside femininity as a destiny, as a biological reality. You can say, just because I'm female, there is no reason why I should write about those things. And that is a respectable position to take. It's not a position I ever felt able to take. I felt that I had an obligation, I guess, to try to describe some of these things, and more, I suppose, to sort of clarify representations of reality for other people. And I mean, in some cases, I feel I have, my book about motherhood. Yeah. I mean, it's 20 years ago that I wrote it, and it's still being read and responded to today. And so I think, okay, that was that was sort of worth the trouble it took to write these things down. Because there are so many aspects of female experience that are just incredibly fleeting and transitory and impossible to commemorate, because they're so embroiled in it's all about being attached to others and being embroiled in life, and the movement away from that, which is the artistic movement away from life to find the solitude to create some commentary on it or representation of it, is really, really difficult to do in ordinary female existence. And you have endless stories of Jane Austen writing behind the sitting room door, and she wasn't even embroiled in the more conventional ways. So trying to get some of that stuff down has been it just feels like that was what I was obliged to do.
Yeah, and I know you've written whole books about these subjects, but can you tell us maybe the conventions or commonplaces related to the subjects of womanhood or motherhood that irritate you more, that pisses you off? Things you keep listening, even from feminist points of view, from schools of feminism, that really get under your skin.
Well, I don't tend to take much notice of anything anymore. I mean, I think that dissimulation, willful pretending that something is the case when it's not, is very, very, very deeply knitted in with a lot of conventional female identities. And the difficult thing about that is that actually in so many lights, that ability to say that everything's fine is in fact really courageous, and a good is it looks very like virtue, and it is virtue and strength sometimes, that even if being having 4 small children prevent you, is incredibly difficult, that you're going to say that it's okay, that you're going to say you're enjoying it, and that has to be seen as strong in some way. And yet the problem with it is that it creates secrecy, it creates misapprehensions, and the next generation falls for those misapprehensions and then can't choose, can't see where their choices are going to lead them. And I think it's a very, very common aspect of femininity, that the discovery of what something is really like behind the image that's been generated of it is a shocking, over and over again, a shocking experience in a girl's life, in a woman's life, and in the end, I guess it is right to give people truth, so that they are free to choose what they want to do.
Mm-hmm. And I jotted down this line from the book. You say, again, it's my translation: the ego the ego of an artist is very similar to the ego of a mother, yeah, we read in the novel. Do you personally subscribe this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of room for comparison, except that, I mean, one of the things that interests me is the attempt to experience motherhood as creativity, and the very often kind of tragic result of that, because a child is not a created object. And I think that the sort of squandered creativity of women that is you know, all around us everywhere, and that I mean, not in our time particularly, but certainly in history. I suppose the mother's use of language as her weapon, and the narrating of the family story, the telling of what the family is and who everybody is and what their characters are and what role they play, and you kind of have to see that as and I mean, I think a lot of women my age who I hope are the last generation who have lives that are radically different from their mothers' lives, and that has created a unique kind of difficulty, I think, for women my age, and it's something that you know, I do find written about in the work of women writers my age, and I suppose that feeling of your mother's femininity being inflicted on you as powerless and yet controlling, and yet you're expected to almost, you, the girl who's going to go off and pass your exams and do very well, and you're expected to kind of behave like a man, and that you know, these transitions can be very brutal. You know, change doesn't always happen gradually. It has these sort of brutal moments of atomization.
And I read you saying also in an interview, I thought interesting. I annoy because I'm not interested in the group, only in the individual. Do you still think the same? Because that's an interview you gave, I think, several years ago to The Guardian.
Having lived in the United Kingdom for the last 5 years, I definitely have no time for the group.
Because you have declared that Great Britain feels aversion towards also self-examination. Yeah? So is therefore, I don't know, all honest or raw attempt on literary autobiography doomed to be shunned and misunderstood? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the English, there's a fundamental unseriousness to the English literary tradition, and that's not a crime. That's not necessarily a negative. It's very different from the continental tradition. It's the novel is for an English novelist, that form is a difficult place to introduce seriousness. The English are uncomfortable around seriousness, and it's absolutely astonishing to me how, you know, even in our, you know, we've shown what a completely divided society we are. That has, you know, absolutely risen to the surface, and so it always astonishes me the works that create incredibly high levels of agreement, so that even in this very divided country, everybody agrees about Dickens, for instance, or Shakespeare, or Jane Austen. So these writers, or indeed J.K. Rowling, these writers, it may be the consequence, I suppose, of this unseriousness that is the absolute condition of English literature. The writers who really, really succeed powerfully are the ones who understand how to get both sides to agree. So, I wish that was something I had worked out earlier in my life, rather than trying to have an argument with the other side.
And more on Great Britain, I'm sorry. Okay. Brexit has pushed you to establish yourself in Paris. But do you think that nevertheless that would be a move that will have happened eventually? That Brexit is just the final push?
Yeah, I think... I think national identity is a questionable thing anyway. I think my feeling of having come to a place unwillingly, having been removed from where I was and put down in a new place where I didn't know anyone or anything, that's a very specific condition. It's a very specific experience, and a book I've been reading a lot lately is V.S. Naipaul's The Enigma of Arrival, which deals with that experience of placelessness, of being an outsider, which you always are. If you arrive late, you are always an outsider. And in this book, he almost paints. It's the closest I've ever read of a text painting with words. He almost paints the English countryside that he finds himself in, and almost as if he can identify every single molecule of its reality, that he will belong to it. So I think there's something interesting for me in then leaving the place, and it's almost like you've been in prison, and that when you leave, they hand you back the things you came in with, your keys and your wallet or whatever, and and that's really what I feel. I almost feel I've been handed back a very basic identity that I arrived with, and so, and I think learning a new language and having to live in a new language is a very refreshing, extremely difficult but refreshing thing to do, and it's a second life. It's a second life in language. I'm about 3 at the moment. So I've got a long time to live in French. Yeah.
So one last question before we move to the audience, before we give them the chance to ask you, a bit philosophical to finish. You said that for me, writing and living are the same thing, or they ought to be. Okay, I can see how living more can improve your writing, no? But does it also happen the other way around? I mean, the more you write, the more you learn how to live?
No.
Okay. Straight answer. Yeah.
I don't think so. I'll think about it.
Okay.
We'll talk about it later.
Okay. I'll give you some time. I told you it was philosophical. Molt bé, ara donarem pas a les preguntes del públic. Tenim un micro. Si algú aixequi... aixequeu la mà, sisplau. Ningú? Això és trencar el gel, Mira. Okay.
Hi. I would like to ask you to expand a little bit on what you said about these writers who are agreed by or who are part of the English canon, and especially the comment that you made about them not being, or being very playful or not being serious enough.
Sorry, I missed most of that. It's very difficult to hear with the mask
maybe if
on.
you could,
if you take your mask off when you,
maybe
I think we'll all put up with it. Yeah.
I mean, there is a mask everywhere, even the
double mask.
Sorry. Well, I want to ask you about to expand a bit more on what you just said about these works, British works, which are part of the canon, and it seems that both sides of the British population agreed on them. And the reason that specifically what I wanted to ask you was, I was a bit surprised when you said that English literature or the canon is not very serious, or that it's very playful, because you mentioned some writers that somehow I don't associate them with being playful, like Dickens, for example.
Dickens, oh my God, Dickens is a laugh a minute. Dickens is, yeah, Dickens is an extremely comic writer, and but maybe his jokes don't translate terribly well. I don't know. No, I mean the English tradition is picaresque in a way. I mean, I think you think about, I don't know, Fielding, Tom Jones, Chaucer. Before that, sort of bawdiness and laughter are, and even in Shakespeare. There's always the fool, the use of comedy to I suppose, relieve or contrast with seriousness and tragedy. So, but I think, I guess by seriousness, I mean the sort of philosophical tradition that you can see in the French novel, and indeed the nature of French realism, even. That tradition being, someone like Flaubert is that's a million miles away from a Dickens or a George Eliot, or I think the sense of narrative and storytelling and endings, happy endings, and that feels like something that's much closer to the heart of the English tradition than the European tradition.
Alguna pregunta més?
You can ask in not in English, and it will be translated.
I also wanted to ask you to expand a little bit on. So you place yourself in this middle between, if I understood it correctly, between people doing self-fiction or auto-fiction.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned The Enigma of Arrival by Naipaul. I always place that in close to that side of the, but maybe you would disagree. And then at the other side, these writers that claim not to put anything personal there or not to be serious, if I understood you correctly in that sense. I'm afraid I haven't yet read a new novel. I'm familiar with the trilogy. But there are many differences with other people, but reading the trilogy, I placed you close to the Naipaul or auto-fiction side. So I'm curious. I'd like you to say a little bit more about this place, this location that you put yourself in this middle.
I think that the sort of new writing of auto-fiction didn't come out of the old writing. My writing has come out of the old writing. It's come out of a classical tradition, and it is in conversation with that tradition. And even though it might have arrived in a general location where autofiction also is, I've had to go a much longer route. Annoyingly, I see the essence of autofiction being that it begins radically. It begins from a radical proposition and a radical use of self. And I feel some envy stroke admiration of those writers. I think it can only have arisen from a state of personal freedom, a sense of the personal freedom of the self, such that it can be used in this extremely correct way, that I think is a very hopeful and positive human quality. So that writing, when done properly, I think it achieves more artistically and morally than most other things do. And, like all good things, it then spawns very, very bad imitations. And I think the critical vocabulary is just is really emerging around those writers, and that's always exciting to see people trying to kind of get to grips with the new and to work out what it's doing, and I guess I see what I'm doing as having been a bit more of a slog because I've felt tied to reality in a more political way. I've felt that I needed to have those arguments and make those points, and that my concerns, I guess, were less to do with me or the use I could make of me, and more to do with the universal things that just happened to cross through me because of what I happened to be. Does that answer your question? Maybe not.
Hey, I was interested about what you said about finding form in your life and using it as a structure for your books. And I wanted to ask explain it a little bit more about that. Like, is it like exactly like looking at certain things in your life from a certain perspective, or how do you extract the form? Has that worked the same way for all your books, or how you found your form?
It isn't really about things in my life. I guess it's thinking, it's trying to see places where living, not just for me, but for everybody, has a shape, where there are things that sort of everybody would recognize and understand, and that's a very it's a pretty general. I'm really not talking about close up specific things. I mean, there are some big passages of life that are very formless, and then there are others that are very distinct and developmental, and trying to see what I mean, the as I said earlier, the difficulty for me in trying to sort of understand the kind of later lives of women is precisely this absence of form. It's very, very hard to find a form in it, to find any common shape or common experience. There are other things. Divorce, for instance, has a very, very, very clear shape. Not a very pleasant shape, but so I think it's there's actually a reverse to that, which would because what I'm saying is not I'm not the only person who, there's a reason why novels often are about people falling in love, for instance, and because that is a shape of a form that everybody recognizes and usually lives with some intensity, and then likes to see in a book. And I guess there's the opposite of that is in fact trying to write about living where it has no form. And I'm not that kind of writer, but that too is interesting, because it's also, that almost again is a sort of form, even if it's an anti-form. We all know what that feels like when living seems incredibly shapeless and non-directed. I hope that's an answer.
Okay. Maybe we have time for one more question. Maybe
I think
last
this
question.
lady had her hand up.
Oh.
Hi there.
Hello.
I don't know if that's too loud. I was interested to hear you talking about a sort of obligation to tell how things really are, because it strikes me that your writing has always been about questions, not answers, and that if I've learned anything from reading you for years and years, it's about how there's always intellect, that finding your position is almost an intellectual argument that could go on forever and ever. And that's what fascinates me about reading you. And so I was interested, and I wondered if maybe you had more answers than you give away, and that you then construct that into the story, reaching a position which you already knew.
Yeah, I think, to me, that those explanations are really arduous process. It's like whoever makes fishing nets, or it's the tying of every single bit, all around the thing that I'm trying to attach something to a bare fact, and so yeah, I guess the working out of it does seem more considered rather than an impulse to sort of bear witness to something. But I think that the telling part of it for me lies in the very first decision about what needs to be told, and that's something where people, writers, and I'm one of them, are incredibly misjudged. It's as if there's a sort of, an incontinent kind of, you just blurt out everything private that happens to you, but for me that trying to discern between something that I know, because it's something that only I know, as it were, because it happens in my completely private sphere of being, and something that looks very like that actually needs to be passed on. Telling the difference between those two things is I guess a discipline, in that you might want to pass it all on, but yeah, I think that for me is the most political part of writing, and it's the most dangerous part, because it makes people very angry. It can make people very angry. It feels like you're sort of spoiling the fun, or sort of giving away the secret, or and any emotional, possibly kind of wounded in some way person struggles to tell the difference between those two things, and I suppose it's in the working out afterwards, asking questions of that thing and then attempting to answer it, that I suppose I verify that it was the right thing to be told. Sorry, that's an extremely convoluted answer to your question.
Great answer, thank you.
Crec que hem d'anar acabant, no? Hem d'acabar aquí l'acte, amb els apuntadors que em diuen. Sí? So we'll leave it here, okay. Bueno, que sapigueu que si algú vol que la Rachel el signi al llibre, estarà encantada de fer-ho. I res. Rachel, thank you very much for finding the time for being with us here this evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.